I wouldn't characterize it as a protest, but I would characterize it, I don't agree with how he's prosecuting the war at this stage. I do think you have a real tangible ceasefire deal that's on the table that could pause the war and hopefully get to a permanent ceasefire, but could also allow the release of hostages. The reason why I made the decision that I did in terms of not attending is after meeting with families of hostages, American hostages yesterday, the one ask they had of us was to put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to the ceasefire deal, to publicly agree to it. And he's not meeting with us here on the Hill. So this is one way that I thought I could make a statement to try to get to that ceasefire deal and get the families that have loved ones being held hostage released.
So, Congressman, do you think that Republicans in your chamber, in Congress more widely, are putting that pressure on Netanyahu? Or does the pressure by and large have to come from the executive branch and President Biden?
I think the pressure should come from all of us because there should be a paramount urgency. It's 292 days that people have been held hostage in really cramped quarters. We heard from one survivor who was released back in the last hostage release about how horrific the conditions were. So I think there is an urgency to put pressure on the prime minister to accept this ceasefire, to publicly say so, and then look for a path forward. There is an opportunity to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, with the other Arab countries, to expand on the Abraham Accords and think about a different future here. And I'm in full support of Israel. I think Israel is a Jewish state that we should protect, but I would like to see a different future for the whole Middle East.
Well, we know that President Biden, together with Prime Minister Netanyahu, will be meeting with the families of American hostages that are still being held by Hamas tomorrow after their bilateral meeting at the White House. But Congressman, you and I both know, as do they, that this meeting is happening in the context of what has been an incredible week in U.S. politics with Biden's decision not to seek re-election. Are you concerned that his ability to exercise leverage over Netanyahu and the Israeli government is now diminished because of his decision not to seek a second term?
No, because I think President Biden has been a steadfast supporter of Israel, but he's also made hard decisions, and he's had very direct conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think what President Biden did last Sunday was the symbol of character and leadership, putting country first. And I think that's what we're asking Prime Minister Netanyahu to do. I understand the political risk that he has in terms of holding his coalition of hard-right individuals in Israel together. But listening to the family of the hostages, understanding what I hear from leading Israeli security officials and others, this is a good ceasefire. They negotiated it. They agreed to it. I don't expect Hamas or Sinwar to necessarily agree to the terms of the deal, but let's put the pressure on them by actually having Prime Minister Netanyahu come out and say he supports the ceasefire deal that's been negotiated. Now, if Sinwar doesn't, the pressure and focus is on him.
Yeah, and I wonder to what extent we'll hear about how Joe Biden wants a ceasefire achieved during the remainder of his presidency when he addresses the nation from the Oval Office in prime time tonight, Congressman. We also expect that he may have some words about his Vice President Kamala Harris. When it comes specifically to the issue of Israel, how would you expect her policy would differ if she were elected in November?
I think if she's elected in November, I think she would continue some of the same policies of the Biden administration. I think she might be a little bit more forceful in saying the time is now for a ceasefire. There's a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. That is not war. That is something we have the ability to relieve: food, water, medications. There's an urgency to get that done. And I think about that from the perspective of being a doctor. I also, again, I'm not letting Hamas off the hook. I'm not letting Yahya Sinwar off the hook, the military leader of Hamas. What they did on October 7th was atrocious. But I do think for the sake of the Israel that I'd like to see, the Israel that I saw last summer, pre-October 7th, I'd like to see a different future. And I know we're holding the possibility of a deal with Saudi Arabia open, but it gets harder and harder the longer this war continues.
Well, Congressman, I'm glad you raised the humanitarian aspect here because that has been a challenge for the incumbent administration. Does Kamala Harris, if she becomes President Harris, need to do a better job than the administration she's been attached to for the last 3.5 years on that front?
Well, I think the President Biden and the team around President Biden have been trying to put as much pressure on the Israelis to allow humanitarian aid to flow freely into Gaza. One of my disagreements with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and another reason why I'm not there, is I think he's been reluctant to allow that aid to flow in, and I think that's a big mistake. And again, my hope is when he gives his address to Congress today, that we hear from him. It's like, it's time for us to end this war. It's time for us to get the hostages home. We've got a good ceasefire deal on the table. Let's accept that ceasefire deal. And now the pressure's on Hamas to accept that deal. I don't know if we'll hear that, but that's what I would love to hear.
Well, I guess we'll all find out just about half an hour from now. As you speak to the humanitarian aspect of all of this as a doctor, I'd like to ask you another question in your capacity, not just as a congressman, but as a doctor, knowing there have been many Republicans, including from within your own chamber, who have suggested that if Biden is not fit to campaign and stand for re-election, he should no longer be fit to sit in the Oval Office. As a doctor, what do you say to that?
As a doctor, I say, I've interacted with the president in recent months. I'm interacting with this team. I've seen the decisions that they're making, that he's making, and I have no reservations about his capacity to run this country and govern.
Well, we'll see what he says about that ability, or if he addresses this at all in his Oval Office speech tonight. We also understand that in part what he wants to accomplish with this speech is to outline the things he would still like to get done in the remainder of his term. He effectively now is a lame duck. You and your colleagues in Congress can't call it the lame duck session quite yet, as we still have an election to get through. But are you hopeful that more legislative accomplishment can come during this administration? And if you are, what would it be?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a vigorous President Biden. I think we're going to see the character and leadership that are the hallmarks of Joe Biden. And I think I'll speak directly to the country about how we move forward. And part of that is that transition to the next generation. But he's still got, there's still a lot going on in the world. You've got a war in Europe. You're trying to end a war in the Middle East, and you're trying to prevent a war in Asia. We've still got a lot to do in terms of rebuilding our economy, jobs, and addressing inflation. I think he'll talk to the things that he hopes to accomplish, and I hope he has a Congress that's willing to work with him.